let's start. Thanks very much for coming. I'm Vince Horiuchi. I'm with the University of Utah's College of Engineering, and I think you're here for a really exciting session because it's about video games. I mean, who doesn't like video games? Whether you're the 15-year-old hardcore gamer, you don't like video games, oh, okay, get out of here. Whether you're a 15-year-old hardcore gamer or you're a CEO in a meeting playing Words with Friends or something, I mean, everybody plays games. And we have really some of the top professionals, not just in the state, but in the country here today to talk about the video gaming history in Utah, which is really, I think, an incredible story and why it's part of this technology conference. I mean, if you have a technology conference about Utah, you really can't have that discussion without video games. And let me introduce our panel, which is really a great panel of people. To my immediate left is Bob Kessler. Bob has had a varied career in computer science that spans more than 3 decades. I mean, that includes as a programmer, a research scientist, founder of software companies. He started gaming early, first as a game tester, then as a games journalist, and then as a co-founder of the independent video game co-op Game Makers Anonymous. He also co-founded the U's Entertainment Arts and Engineering program, and along with Bob has taken that school to new heights. I mean, EAE in just 4 short years, Bob and Roger have turned that program into one of the best video game schools in the entire country. Its undergraduate program is currently ranked 2nd in the country by the Princeton Review, and its graduate program is ranked 4th in the United States. So congratulations. It's an incredible school. If you're interested in seeking video game design, the University of Utah is the place. Next to Roger is Mark Van Langenveld, and Mark's had a long career in gaming and computing. In addition to teaching about games through all of his career, he's designed and directed, and this is really cool, interactive music videos for Sting and Peter Gabriel. He also produced the very first interactive television show called Vine Street for Microsoft. He's had a long stint working for Microsoft, and he arrived in Utah to work for a famed Salt Lake City gaming company called Access Software. I don't know if you people remember that gaming company. They produced a great golf simulation called Lynx and a great set of adventure games called Tex Murphy, the adventure games. Absolutely wonderful. Thanks for coming, Mark.
Thank you.
Next to Mark is John Blackburn. Now, John is a co-founder and general manager of Avalanche Software, which launched in 1995, making games for virtually every console. You may have heard some of them. He made a number of Mortal Kombat games, as well as an open world game called 25 to Life. But in 2005, the company was acquired by Disney, and his studio started making popular games based on Disney movies, including Toy Story, Cars, Meet the Robinsons, and more. Now his company has embarked on their biggest and most popular project now called Disney Infinity for every console. It's a huge gaming platform. It's one of the best-selling console games last year and so far this year. And it is an open-world game that involves the use of figurines from Disney characters. And they've just launched their version 2.0, if you will, of the game just this week. And it involves using Marvel superhero characters. It's just going to be a license to print.
And he's still awake.
And he's still awake, and I really appreciate him being here. Finally, at the far end is Mike Bartholomew, and I really appreciate Mike being here because he's in the middle of crunch time on his next game, and I know that consumes your time, so I really appreciate that he made the time to come here. Mike's had a long career in gaming too in Salt Lake City that spans more than 20 years. He was one of the founders of the first video game companies to start here, Single Track Entertainment. If you've been around here long enough, you'll know what that is. It's a very famous company that produced such huge titles for the Sony PlayStation as Jet and Warhawk, and of course Twisted Metal. Since then, he's worked for Incognito Entertainment, and he's now on the board of directors and is the director of online technology for mobile gaming company Eat Sleep Play, which, by the way, Eat Sleep Play just last year released their hit game Running with Friends for mobile devices, and in its first week, it landed #1 on iTunes App Store for free games, which, if you've ever produced an app, that is almost impossible to do. So I think they're going to probably repeat that success with the new game as soon as it's published. He won't tell me what it is or he'd have to kill me, so we'll find about that hopefully soon. And I want to mention that both John and his company has their game, Disney Infinity 2.0, or the Marvel Superheroes game, out on a display for you guys to look at and play just outside. And Mike has an old game that he helped produce called Twisted Metal, the original Twisted Metal for the PlayStation 1. And that's out there for you to play as well, so you can see the games that were made then and the games that are made now in Salt Lake City. Now, let's start off by a little presentation that both Bob and Roger are going to give about the history of computing and video game development in Utah.
Okay. We can't. There's no way back. Okay, so I'm just going to try to dim the lights. So what we're going to do is we're going to weave together some history, which is the history of computer games, where they actually came from, and Utah's participation in that. University of Utah's Department of Computer Science, its founding in the 60s, and some of the people that influenced that. And we're going to talk about a number of people, Nolan Bushnell, Ralph Baer, David Evans, and Ivan Sutherland. So let's start with David Evans. So he was born in Salt Lake City in 1924 and got his PhD at the University of Utah. After that, he worked for Bendix Corporation, and there he was working on the design of some early computers for that company. And then he decided, I think I'm going to go off and go back into academia, and went to work for University of California, Berkeley. What this program could do, it moved the cursor around, and it's funny watching these old videos. They don't call them cursors; they just say move this little square thing around. And anyways, you'll see in a minute that they will actually draw a line, and he does that by marking a starting location, and then he pushes a button on a big thing next to it, and then draws this line around, and then can draw lines and circles and erase them and stuff. So this was part of his PhD dissertation back in 1963, which was some of the first interactive uses of computer graphics. So then, which blows my mind here, is that in 1963 he graduated with his PhD, and then the next year he was head of this whole ARPA organization, which is sending out millions and millions of dollars of funding right out of school. Not something that would happen these days, but that's what happened to him. And as it says, he helped to fund David Evans at Berkeley, and that's when they started getting together. Ivan then, after a year or 2 years at ARPA, then went off to Harvard, and at Harvard University, and one of the big projects that he worked on there was something called the Sword of Damocles. And what this was one of the first examples of virtual and augmented reality. And you can kind of see in these pictures, it's this head-mounted display. I have to make this play again. That's attached up in the environment above it, and it's tracking your head movements. And so as you move around in that environment, it's actually then projecting onto your eyes, or you can see through the vision. You can see the box. You can just barely see the outline of that box. And that was in the room that you're in. And so for those of you who heard of the Oculus Rift, this is what 50 years later that they were doing in those days, although it's not nearly as portable and as high a resolution and all that, but 50 years ago is when this was done. He was recruited by David Evans to come to the University of Utah as a faculty member, and in 1969 they actually completed the full pieces of the head-mounted display. 1969, another notable date, which is not really about graphics, but it certainly is key to the way the game industry has evolved these days, was in essence, the birth of the internet. In those days, it was called the ARPANET, and there were 3 nodes in California, and the first interstate node, the first interstate hub, as far as networking goes, was at the University of Utah. So that was the 4th node. And then, as it says, December 1969 is when they finally got all 4 of those working together and starting. That's the very beginning of the internet. And then we have to talk about me. So why the hell am I here? Well, the reason is that in the summer of 1970, I was a high school student. And I came to the University of Utah. And they had an 8-week program where you learned how to program. And in those days, it was a programming language called Fortran. And then what I did is I worked with a graduate student who was working under the direction of a professor. This graduate student, his name was Roger DeBry, and the professor was Harvey Greenfield. And what we were doing at that time is I was helping him build a simulation on a computer, so the same kinds of oscilloscope type computers that you saw there, of fluid flowing in, fluid flows. So the idea is that there's these dots representing the water, and then you would drop a pebble in it, and you would see the waves that were created by the turbulence of that ball or the pebble falling in the water. Roger published his dissertation in 1973 when it's called The Simulation of Arbitrary Shaped Boundaries for Hemodynamic Studies. And what they were actually doing was blood flow through an artificial heart valve. And they were trying to simulate whether the artificial heart valve would actually work. And so that's where my connection goes. Now, what Dave Evans and Ivan Sutherland did is they had this massive ARPA project and brought in some amazingly talented students. And these talented students really founded what were the beginning foundings of computer graphics as we know it today. So on the right there, that picture of that triangle and that square, that was John Warnock. John Warnock eventually went on to found Adobe and PDFs and all those things. That was his company. And what his dissertation was about was how do you take two shapes that are a triangle and a square and make it so that one appears to be behind the other one. It's called hidden surface algorithm, and it's called the Warnock algorithm. So he was the first one to do that. Down here on the bottom, it's a little hard to see, but Ed Catmull in 1974 did what's called texture mapping. And the idea of that is that you take an object that you've created a model of it, and you put some kind of a surface on there or a photograph. And as you can see on the left, this is the Utah teapot, and they put a picture of a woman on there, and on the right it was a picture with some windows, and that appeared on the teapot. And so he's the first person to invent texture mapping. Ed Catmull went on to found Pixar. So amazing kinds of technology came out of the University of Utah in the late 60s and the 70s, all in computer graphics. And today, when we use computers, they have taken all the same algorithms, have been optimized and improved, but they're still fundamentally in all the kinds of computer graphics that we're doing today. All right. Lastly, so Dave Evans and Ivan Sutherland founded the Evans and Sutherland Corporation in 1968, and they focused on simulation and training. How could you use these computer graphic systems to actually train people? Many of the Utah students were employed there. They went public in 1978, and their systems were so advanced that by the year 2000, 80% of airline pilots that were flying airplanes in the 2000 had actually trained on their systems. And so it's a highly successful company. And now we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and Roger's going to talk about the history of gaming.
All right, so I'm going to chat a little bit about the history of games, and specifically how it relates to Utah. And I think it's going to set up our panel discussion really well. So where we'll leave off with is how these games companies started in Salt Lake City. I also think it's important to note that, that we're really grateful for the opportunity to speak here. Normally, a state history conference wouldn't hold this kind of event, and it's really wonderful to see the recognitions of games and technology and the importance to the history it plays in the state. So we just want to thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity. Tennis for Two is, there's a lot of arguments about what the first game is. A lot of people will point to Space War at MIT and argue that maybe Tennis for Two is more of a toy than a game. But I think it really represents the very first video game ever made. It sort of gets to this history of video games. It's on an oscilloscope. It was made at Brookhaven National Labs by William Higginbotham. And the point of it was to really show off what the technology could do, to make it interesting for visitors who came in and to see something fun. And it represents tennis, right? It's the side view of tennis. So you have a little net in the middle and a little ball that bounces back and forth. Custom controller to make that happen. And at the time, no one realized the importance of this. 2 years later, it's completely disassembled. It's gone. No one thought about commercializing it. It was just sort of a fun thing to have that was hacked together for people who came and visited the lab. In 1962, and I guess the other important thing to recognize is, of course, that's a military-funded lab. And so we see in the early days of games, a lot of what happens in games is spin-off from military technology. So in 1962, we get this idea of Space War, and Space War is a really interesting game for a number of reasons. So Steve Russell and his whole crew there at MIT put this thing together in another ARPA-funded lab. And it takes a supercomputer, a PDP-1, a big, huge computer, and says, what can we do that's really interesting, really fun, and novel? And then on off hours, they create a video game. And it's always hard to see on the videos, but Space War is actually an extremely advanced game. It's multiplayer, you have 2 rocket ships, right? And you center around a gravity well in the middle, and then you shoot at each other. So you have thrust to thrust your rocket ship forward, like in the old arcade game Asteroids. You can turn your ship around, point it in different directions, and shoot as well. It had a star field in the background, with little stars, little twinkling stars in the background. And they lucked out that the oscilloscope made sounds, hums, and the hums would sound like the thrusts of the rocket. So as they were triggering the animation, the machine would make sound effects. That was an unintended, delightful consequence that they got for working on the machinery. What's great about Space War, though, is the idea of a background in a game, the idea of a game had never been thought of. They hadn't seen what happened at Brookhaven, so it was completely new for them. So it's got a lot of advanced rules, a lot of advanced concepts, and more interesting is this idea that people put this together for fun. They hacked this together with technology, and in fact, a lot of them were even using the term hacker back then to describe themselves. So Space War is a game that then lives on in public memory much more than Tennis for Two ever did. And you can still play emulators of this online if you look up Space War. So Nolan Bushnell is where, he's arguably the father of video games. He's been called numerous times. And he's an alumni of the University of Utah. Most famous for working at Lagoon. No, actually that's not true. Most famous for starting the company Atari, right? But he's got a number of stories about how he got the ideas for games and what the origin of games were. And one of the favorite ones that we've heard him tell is this story that when he was working at Lagoon, one of his jobs was to repair mechanical midway games. And that one of his favorite games was a game that had a carpet that rolled, right? So you stood in front of this big mechanical box and you had a skier on a stick. And you'd move this skier around and you would hit little metal trees, little metal rocks, and you would, lose points for doing it. And it was constantly breaking down. And he thought to himself, there's gotta be a better way of doing midway games than this, right? There have been lots of stories over the years, but it's a charming one. And it sort of points to this idea that maybe some of the stuff that he did at Lagoon and some of the stuff he did at the U really brought those things together. One of us did something.
Oh, jeez.
We'll blame that ad standing behind you.
Sorry.
Don't notice the guy behind the screen.
Couldn't be supposed to scare me.
I know, it's hard not to press my, there's so many here. So he wrote several games for the PDP-1. He was playing Space War constantly at the U. His argument of why he came to the U and was doing stuff at the U was because that's where advanced graphics were happening. And so we see this story of a lot of the stuff that was happening in graphics motivates games and some of the stuff that's happening with entertainment later on. Wanted to do computer games, but it was too costly. Computers were ridiculously expensive. There was no way to commercialize a PDP-1. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars. So there was no commercial model at the time. But that idea never left him. Later on, we start to see this idea from someone named Ralph Baer on the other side of the country in New York, working for Magnavox. So Ralph arguably does lots of sketches about games and has lots of ideas about games and toys as working for an engineer at Magnavox, working on TVs. And the story goes that he had this notebook that went with him everywhere, and he would sit at the bus stop and just draw out crazy ideas of fun things you could do with TVs. And he was building things like a light gun, so he was motivated by the old shooting galleries where he'd shoot BBs and knock over plates and things like that. So he thought to himself, why can't we do that on the TV? And he built several versions of the light gun and all sorts of fun design sketches. And what he really comes up with, though, is this idea of sending a signal to a TV from a computer and controlling it and moving it around. And so what he creates is something known as this ping pong game, and then later on the brown box, and we'll talk about the brown box in a minute. And the ping pong game looks remarkably like Pong, doesn't it? In his version, however, you can see as he explains and plays it, the box has knobs on it, and that controls both the paddles going up and down, as well as left and right. The box also had a knob on the side to simulate English, meaning that when you hit the ball, you could twist it and make the ball go, all sorts of squirrely directions. His idea of the way video games should be developed was actually very interesting, though. He believed that these were more like automated pieces of board games. So the notion of it creating like scores, for example, hadn't occurred to him. Or the notion that, so the idea the rules of this game would still be enforced by the players on this side of the screen. You'd be banging the ball back and forth with the paddles, but you'd still keep score with paper, right? And if somebody broke the rule, like there was nothing to stop one paddle from crossing the line, well, that was just like real tennis, wasn't it? If you went and you jumped over the net, I would call foul on you, and we'd fight. But so that's what his idea was. It would be like more like that. And so in 1968, files a very important video game patent. Really files several patents, but the one that really makes him a lot of money is this idea of cartridges and this idea of sending video signals to TVs in an interactive manner. And although Magnavox never makes a lot of money off of selling video games, they make a ton of money off of the patents in the early days of video games. So in 1968, so notice like these are happening concurrently, right? He teams up with a buddy and they say, look, computers are finally cheap enough that we can make something with it. Let's make a game that we can release to the public. It's only $4 grand for a computer. Let's do this thing, right? And it was way too slow. They couldn't get any games to run on it. It was fine for, accounting, actuarial kinds of things, but it just wasn't enough to push graphics, especially interactive graphics. So it was that. And they sort of custom built methods then, circuit boards of their own, and played with this idea of, can we build our own hardware to send signal back and forth to a TV? And on the other side of the country again, in New York, Ralph Baer is progressing on the same notion. And the brown box is developed. The brown box is called the brown box because you might remember in the 70s, the contact paper was really popular. And there was wood grain contact paper that people would put on everything. And that included electronics. So Ralph Baer wrapped one of the first video game systems ever made in brown wood grain contact paper, right? And as a result, it was called the brown box. Multiplayer, played ping pong, volleyball, football, had a light gun accessory, played light gun games. And what was really clever about this was the system didn't really, like I said, enforce many rules. So the way you did it was you would use a piece of clear cling film and colored cling film and put it on the TV. The static of the TV would hold the film in place. So if you were playing roulette, for example, you would have a little white dot that would go around in a circle and you'd spin your dial and it would go around in a circle. So how did you actually play roulette? You had a piece of felt in front of you with all the places where you put markers on it, little chips, and then you'd have what looked like a transparency for a roulette wheel, and you just stick it on your TV. And the static would hold it there, and that's how you got advanced graphics at the time, right? So you got lots of colors and really great graphics because it was all hand drawn and basically stuck to a TV with cling film. So let's see, that's the one now. So in 1970, Bushnell creates the first commercialized coin-op computer game, Computer Space. And this is where things start to get interesting in terms of the history of games. Computer Space is a commercialized version of Space War, that game that was created in the early 60s at MIT. And it doesn't sell very well, it's a little too complicated for people, it's a bit too expensive to make, right? It gets hired on at Nutting and gets some royalty on the sale. So Nutting is really the people who make the first coin-op game, Computer Space. And it looks like this, right? The gameplay itself looks remarkably like Space War. And again, we're sorry for it being washed out up on the top right. The consoles themselves are just gorgeous, right? I mean, they look like the 70s, don't they, right? I mean, they look like, like Corvettes. They come in metallic, fiberglass shells and all sorts of different colors. And you have to remember that people had never, for most people, they had never seen a video game when they walked up to this thing. They'd seen pinball machines and they'd seen mechanical arcade games, but when they walked up to Computer Space for the first time, they really had no clue what was going on. And it was too confusing a game to really capture the mass market appeal that people were looking for. Okay, so Computer Space really goes nowhere, right? Magnavox launches the Odyssey. The Odyssey being really arguably the first home console. Launches with a variety of games. It's got 12 cartridges, but way more than 12 games. The reason that it has more than 12 games is because some of the games aren't really games on the cartridge. You would just put in a cartridge and it would put a white dot on the screen and it would allow you to move it around, and that would be the whole game. But if you put a piece of cling film on there with a racetrack, all of a sudden it's a racing game. You peel that off and you put a cling film on there with a mountain, and now it's a skiing game, right? And so you were able to get multiple games out of one computer program. The Odyssey does not sell well, despite lots of efforts by by Magnavox. And the biggest reason was the way that TVs were sold back then was how cars are sold today. There were like dealerships, right? So you would go to the Magnavox store to buy a Magnavox TV, or to the Zenith store or to buy a Zenith TV. Sears hadn't really revolutionized the TV market by representing multiple brands just yet. That happens later. But as a result, many people thought you had to have a Magnavox TV to play the Magnavox Odyssey, which already limited the market pretty significantly.
You can skip that.
And so, yeah, these are what the things look like. These are the little cards. They're cool. We'll skip them. So, Bushnell visits the Magnavox Profit Caravan, so it's a tech show, right? And signs the guest book and sees the Magnavox Odyssey. This is actually really important because when he created Pong, initially he argued he hadn't seen the Magnavox Odyssey. And then later on he says that he had seen the Magnavox Odyssey. So there are stories about when he got the idea for Pong and when he didn't. But the story kind of goes that when he saw it, he really wasn't that impressed with it. Because it didn't really do much of a system. It was just moving graphics around on screen. And as we've seen at the U, this has been happening since the late 50s, right? So his argument was there wasn't much of a game there. It was just graphics moving around on the screen. So he founds Atari, right? And this is a big moment because this is when commercial video games really start to take off. They design Pong, and when Al Alcorn designs Pong, Nolan tells him, quit adding so many features to it. He had learned his lessons from computer space. The game needed to be really simple. So they actually lessened the amount of movement. They could have had the paddle move anywhere, but they locked it in that column, so it only moved up and down. The score was very simple, and it kept track of the score for you. And so Pong is released. And so the Pong cabinets are really interesting. The first one gets sent to a bar in San Francisco, Andy Capp's Tavern, to test out. And after a few days, it stops working. And they call up and they're really angry about it. So they go, oh no, what's wrong with our machine? And they rush out there to find out what it was. And the problem was it was too jammed full of quarters and it had shorted out the machine, right? So what's interesting about it is we actually have one of these at the U. Nolan's on our advisory panel and signed it and everything. It's great. This is the back of a Pong machine. And if you'll notice in the top right-hand corner, what you see is a TV. There was no market at the time for computer games, so there weren't like independent monitors. And Nolan and his fellows at Atari would just hire people to run around San Francisco buying TVs on sale. So the TVs in the Pong machines, they're wildly different, right? So like, I think ours is a white Hitachi, but it's a different TV it seems like in every Pong machine. And they just get strapped in and bolted in and moved around in the right way, and the plastic gets cut and they bolt them in. You'll notice at the bottom of it, you'll see a call out to the bread pan. So there was a 9-inch bread pan, and that was what caught the quarters. So they could borrow some things from pinball machines, right? Like the coin-op mechanism, but they needed something to catch the quarters. What was funny about it was the circuit board on this one is mounted on the correct side, on the right side. On many of them, it's mounted on the left side, too close to the bread pan. The bread pan would overfill with quarters. The quarters would touch the circuit board, fry the whole darn thing, right? So the solution that they sent out to everyone was, take out the bread pan. And then the quarters would just fall to the bottom of the machine and pile up there, right? One of the fun little trivia facts about the original Pong machine is it wasn't grounded originally. And back then, bars actually had carpet, which was probably not the best decision. But people would get static electricity built up on their feet, shock the machine, and get free games. So they had to ship out a patch, which was a grounding strap for the early Pong cabinets. All right, so this is what Pong looked like, right? So Pong gets unveiled, sells about 8,000 units. It's just doing mad business. More quarters than you can imagine, right? Put into these machines. I'm sure many of you have put many a quarter in the Pong machine. And then lots of versions made. There's a version that's made in a barrel to put on top of bars. There's a tabletop version. All sorts of versions of it get created. Right. And then this is where things get exciting. Magnavox sues Atari. And we're going to see this from the beginning of the commercialization of video games, that there's lots of claims made about who owns what technology. So Magnavox claims the idea of sending signals to a TV and interacting with them in a game-like fashion. We own that. And so Atari ends up giving them a lot of money. Nintendo gives them a lot of money. There's a lot of lawsuits going along around these patents. And so patents become part of the history of games, because then when Nintendo makes its console later, in the mid-'80s, it really fights to get patents so that it can secure new ways of doing cartridges. Atari does the same. So you see a lot of money exchanged between these early companies based on these kinds of things. Nolan goes and makes a lot of money, loses a lot of money, and does this several times in his life. From Atari to Chuck E. Cheese to a chain of restaurants in California that had interactive touch screens that you would order at the table, right? Instead of, this is all pre-iPad. And just tons. He's a very entrepreneurial fellow. And so we see lots of lost. He's come and spoke at the U many times and talks about how he's a great guy for $1 to $10 million, but after that he wants someone else to run your company. And it's good that he's honest about that. And so now we get to what we really want to talk about, the meat of our conversation, and hopefully what our panel will know far more about than we know about, to be honest. And that's early Utah game companies, right? So we know that Utah plays a significant role in the development of games, and we're lucky to have some people on the panel here who can talk about it. So you want to moderate the session?
All right, thanks very much. Thanks to Bob and Roger for giving us that history on gaming in Utah. As you can see, it really goes back, if you really want to talk about the 1960s, with people like Nolan Bushnell, people like Ed Catmull in animation, computer animation. If it wasn't for people like that in Utah, who knows if we even have some degree of interactive entertainment today. So we're going to start off with some questions for the panels, and then we'll break it off to any questions that the audience might have. Roger points out that by this time, the commercialization of video games has started with the Atari, the Super Nintendo, and then pretty soon companies start to percolate creating games. And in Salt Lake City and in Utah, as you can see, we've had a number of companies that came up. I know in Salt Lake City, a number of companies, or one company in particular, Single Track, would come from, well, my understanding, 3 or 4 people that came from Evans and Sutherland, the people that made military simulations. And then from Single Track, that spawned some different companies and so forth, along with these other companies like Sculptured Software. But let me present the panel present the question for both Mike, Mark, and John, who have developed video games in Utah for a long time. Why do it seems to make sense, of course, in Seattle or Los Angeles or San Francisco, certainly, that there was a lot of video game development going on in those cities. But why Salt Lake City? There was and is a very healthy video game development community in Utah. Why do you think that was? What was attractive about Salt Lake City? And any of you 3 guys can maybe start it off. Why do you think Salt Lake City was became such a huge place where this was blossoming?
Are we live? Yeah. Well, I think to turn the question around, why not Salt Lake City? Utah is known for its young demographic. Utah is known for its technology base, both of which are key in at least computer-based gaming. I'm going to point at your slide here that says 1995 Single Track. I was one of the original founders of Single Track. There were actually 3 of us. A gentleman named Mike Ryder, who will come up in John's conversation, I think, as a business catalyst for video gaming here in Utah, and has gone on nationwide and even worldwide in the publishing community, and would be a key name in any historical perspective of Utah video gaming. Todd Kelly is the other name, 3rd founder of Single Track. Scott, actually, key here in Salt Lake City, joined us about 6 months after we started. Our history at Evans and Sutherland goes back for a good 10 years prior to that date. So video gaming in Utah, Evans and Sutherland is a key name, a key reason there. Many people look at flight simulation as a giant video game. And for me personally, that was the genesis of video gaming. I fell in love with graphics at E&S. I was doing NASA simulation, helicopter simulation. In Bob's presentation with a little bit of helmet-mounted displays, we were doing helmet-mounted displays in the late 1980s for helicopter sim. And for me, very much a key to the time frame to join video gaming in the 1990s. John, you want to add to that?
So absolutely there was this graphics stuff that was going on here, and so there were a lot of people who had either taken classes or had actually seen it in Utah. And so I'll kind of go more with the sculptured software side. I started in my career there in '92, but the stories that I'd hear about the guys earlier was that they would have any sort of computer, kind of an Apple or a Commodore or those kind of things at the time. And because the gaming industry wasn't all that sophisticated yet, they would just sell either cassette audio tapes that they would have the games on in baggies out of their trunks. So they would make these games and sell them like kind of ad hoc to people like at the university or wherever else. And so it was a very different, kind of industry back then as it started to get founded before there were a lot of publishers and those kind of things. So literally anybody who had an Apple II could make a video game at the time.
I was just thinking of, I think the graphics connection is really strong. When I, back in the very early 80s, when I would go to a conference called SIGGRAPH, it was really, it should have been called the Evans and Sutherland show or conference, because everything was there. And so everyone pointed back to Utah and all the inventions and all of the patents that had been done and just the great studies that had been done here in graphics that pulled people to here. But when I was working for Microsoft and we decided to purchase Access Software, I heard a bunch of stories, but one that really kind of cracked me up was Bruce Carver was the founder of Access Software, and I heard a couple of stories about him, and I don't know how true they are because they were just being told to me from members of his family or people who had been in the company, but he started basically Access Software in his garage. And it got to the point where he was spending so much time and effort out there with just, young people who were willing to give everything to try to figure out how to be able to make something interesting. And his wife had consultations from people in the neighborhood, and basically they told her just to leave him, that he was no good. He was just sitting out in the garage doing nothing, and building games was just one of the stupidest things you could be spending your time, and he was never going to be a successor, never going to be able to support her and her family and those kind of things. And then along the way, he just step by step would build up his this company, and they kind of had a nice thing going on, because sometimes when you build products, you're not really the client, you're not really the person who would use these things. But in his case, when they were building the golf game, he really understood it as a person from both sides, someone developing it and someone who was going to be using this particular item. And as they built this and put this process together, eventually they became the very best-selling golf game in the world. And it was for very particular reasons why it was. The graphics were so good relative to that time, and they focused on making sure that it was almost a simulation, that you could really actually learn and enjoy the golfing experience from that. And we eventually bought the company from him, and at Microsoft, we bought it from him for $54 million, but we didn't actually give him $54 million. We gave him that amount in stock and said that he couldn't use the stock until I think it was 3 years or 4 years. I think it was 3 years after that he didn't get. He got a little bit of money up front, but the most of it was in the stock, and that stock doubled and split and doubled and doubled and split and doubled and split again, and actually moved up. So the amount of money that he made was outrageous for this thing, even though his wife was being counseled to just leave him because he was going to be no good.
Well, yeah, what's Bruce Carver doing now? Do you know? I mean, is he living on an island somewhere with all of his billions?
He passed away with cancer.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear about that. But, it was during that period, too, I think that when Access Software was being purchased by Microsoft, they're starting to see some movement where big publishing companies were getting interested in these Salt Lake developers. GT Interactive, I believe, purchased Single Track. You have other stories of like Sony buying Incognito or partnering with Incognito. Of course, John, your company, which started out as Avalanche Software, it's still called Avalanche Software, but They were purchased by Disney Interactive. There's other examples, Cherry Entertainment, which makes a very, very popular iPhone game called Infinity Blade, was bought out by Epic Games. What do you think, getting back to you three developers, what do you think these big publishing companies, these big companies saw in these Salt Lake City developers, these indie developers, that there was this stream of interest from these big publishers to buy these companies?
Well, I've been through the acquisition process a couple of times. Single Track was acquired by GT Interactive, and then Incognito was acquired by Sony. In both cases, it really boiled down to those companies need content, and they didn't want to compete with anybody else, so it was just easier to acquire the content provider and have them entirely dedicated to their need and not doing business with other people.
I mean, at the heart of it, it's the finances, right? I mean, like, these companies started, at the time, probably in the early 90s, I think most game contracts were like maybe $100,000 to $300,000 to make an entire game. You'd have something like 1 to 4 people kind of working on them on the Super Nintendo. And they could go out and sell 2 million units of that game. And so if you look at, like, I think the contract for Mortal Kombat was $250,000, and they sold to just the Super Nintendo, they sold 2 million units of it. And so the finances were, they needed more and more games. That's all, and they didn't look at the other side. So there was really like a buying spree then before it got into a consolidation kind of phase.
Yeah, for us at Microsoft, it was kind of a control issue. We had had a couple of contracts with different software companies, including Access, that did golf games, and we were taking and publishing it for them, and we got to the point where we just wanted to control that part of it. We wanted to be able to make sure that it would continue on. It was interesting with the Access purchase. There was a lot going on in the industry. That was where they were starting to move into 3D more regularly in this type of a game. The golf game, the Access was almost 2D at that time, and they were going into 3D, and they were starting to make much more people to process the art and to polish the art and to create the assets that were going to be able to be worked for this type of a thing. So I think Access realized 2 things. I think they realized that they were going to need a little bit more support to be able to take it to that next level. The other thing I think that they realized is that there was competitors out there. EA had just started to make a golf game, and they used Tiger Woods as their spokesperson for it, and the 2 were kind of on a collision track. Tiger was definitely taking away some of the market from the Lynx, and so I think they kind of understood that a little bit, that they were going to need a little bit of that. And what I think happened at Microsoft's side is they just wanted to control that. They wanted to be able to take that to the next level and push it and be able to use it all the time, because up till that time what had happened is sometimes Access would do things and publish it with them. Sometimes they would try publishing with somebody else or doing some other project with another company, and this allowed them to know that they would always be able to have that. Of course, things change as it goes along, but that's, I think, the original reason. And that, when I was talking about those first 3 or 4 companies that are up there that started in essence in garages and just did it, they had some kind of a vision that allowed them to say, we can do this, or we want to do this, or an entrepreneurial spirit, or a vision of a particular product, and they kept pushing them out there and pushing them, and they made good products.